Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Hardesty, and I am the chairman of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome you all, either online or joining us at JCU campus, to our first ever virtual lecture to the Roderick Memorial and JCU last lecture for 2020. First, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are all standing today, wherever we are joining. In particular at JCU, that's the Bindal and Wilgurakurrubi people. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to James Cook University and the broader community. We've got people joining us from everywhere. I'm joining you from Canberra. Hello. Henry is joining us from Hobart. And I know that we have at the moment, over 360 people online joining us from around the country. So we also take this moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we all are standing across the country. So welcome again to the annual Colin Roderick Memorial Lecture, hosted by the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies in partnership with JCU's last lecture. This year, we're celebrating our 54th year of operation. And for those who don't know much about the Foundation, it was started in 1966 by Professor Colin Roderick. The Foundation aims to foster the study and appreciation for Australian literature in all its forms. Colin himself is best remembered for promoting the study of Australian literature at a time when it attracted little academic interest. He was a prolific writer, having authored 127 works. And in 1965, he was appointed professor of English at James Cook University, then known as Townsville University College, which is part of the University of Queensland at the time. Colin started the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies a year later, along with a lecture series and an annual book award, both of which we know today as the Colin Roderick Lecture and Award, respectively. He was born in 1911 and passed away in June of 2000. And a few weeks ago, we heard the very sad news that the Foundation's most generous founding benefactor, Margaret Roderick, also passed away. So that was very sad for everybody. She was a wonderful, spirited lady. All who knew her have nothing but great things to say about her. So all of us at the Foundation, we would like to also take this opportunity to pay our respects to Margaret Roderick. Without her, none of what has happened and none of what the Foundation has managed to accomplish over this last more than half century would have been possible. And we honor and remember her contributions and her memory. Before going much further, I'd like to briefly acknowledge a few guests joining us here today, wherever they are virtually. JCU's Chancellor, Bill Twiddell, is joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge Life Governors of Falls, the Honorable Kerry Cullinane, Adjunct Professor Don Gallagher, and Adjunct Professor Stephen Torre. So it's now my great privilege and pleasure to pass the podium, the virtual podium, over to Professor Sandra Harding, who's the Vice Chancellor and President of JCU, and is also my Deputy Chair on the Federation for Australian Literary Studies. So over to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone, to FELS members and supporters, JCU colleagues, students and friends. It's my very great pleasure to join Paul in warmly welcoming you today as we do something quite special, I think, doubly special, this very important lecture. As our JCU colleagues know, each year JCU has an event known as the Last Lecture. We've run this now for around about a decade. It's a lecture that's delivered in the last week of the normal academic year or the traditional academic year. That's always the last week in October. The last lecturer is someone who has received the support of the students and often their colleagues as an exceptional lecturer, an exceptional teacher, someone whose work is important, and who has the capacity to deliver a lecture that will be accessible to the broader community based on their own area of expertise. So the last lecture celebrates the end of the traditional academic year while celebrating an outstanding person, their important work and the learning that has emerged from it. This year, being an odd one with COVID-19 and its effects, and in JCU's 50th anniversary year, and with the Roderick lecture being set in the same week as our planned last lecture, we decided to approach this a little differently. Once the Roderick Memorial Lecture date was settled, we approached our FELS friends and partners with a view to working together on this very special occasion, presenting the Roderick Memorial Lecture and JCU's traditional last lecture together as one event. The FELS choice of their lecturer cemented the deal. And so, as part of celebrating 50 years of JCU and 60 years of higher education in North Queensland, and the end of the normal academic year, while focusing on the important Colin Roderick Memorial Lecture, as well as JCU's last lecture for 2020, we have the last lecturer in the splendid person of Professor Henry Reynolds to present this very special event. A little about Henry. He was born and educated in Tasmania before moving to London and then to James Cook University in Townsville. Henry became one of the pioneers of the history of white Indigenous relations, and the calibre and significance of his widely recognised contribution includes around 20 books, many of which were bestsellers and were awarded literary prizes. Henry is best known for his pioneering work on the history of settler Indigenous relations, which became widely known with the publication of The Other Side of the Frontier in 1981. It was this publication that particularly attracted attention and earned the deep respect of many. During his time in North Queensland, Professor Reynolds struck up a friendship with Murray Islander Eddie Mabo. Eddie was a groundsman at the university, and the two often talked about Mabo's people's rights to their land on Murray Island in the Torres Strait. In his book, Why Weren't We Told?, Henry describes the talks he had with Eddie. And I'm quoting here, Eddie would often talk about his village and about his own land, which he assured us would always be there when he returned because everyone knew it belonged to his family. His face shone when he talked of his village and his land. So intense and so obvious was his attachment to his land that I began to worry about whether he had any idea at all about his legal circumstances. I said something like, you know how you've been telling us about your land and how everyone knows it's Mabo land. Don't you realise that nobody actually owns land on Murray Island? It's all Crown land. Henry reports that Eddie was stunned. How could the whitefellas question something so obvious as his ownership of his land? Henry looked into the issue of Indigenous land ownership in international law together with his colleague Noel Luce, who's there in the audience tonight, and encouraged Eddie Mabo to take the matter to court, and of course the rest of is history. So ladies and gentlemen, Henry Reynolds beautifully combines a focus on literature and history, both as an academic and an activist, as well as a strong connection and a bond to JCU, which he served so very well. In light of your mammoth contribution to your JCU history, the fact that you are also the Colin Roderick Memorial Lecturer in our very special anniversary year adds another layer of significance to this event, Henry, and to JCU's 50th birthday. So to everyone out there virtually or at Central Plaza on the Townsville campus, please join me now in welcoming Professor Henry Reynolds to deliver the Roderick Memorial Lecture and JCU's last lecture for 2020, and the title, Seeing Australian History from the North Down. Over to you, Henry.
Yes, my subject is Seeing Australian History from the North Down. In introducing this, I want to make it quite clear that I began teaching Australian history at the then Townsville University College in 1966 and left Townsville to return to Tasmania in 1999. In other words, I was in Townsville for 33 years. Now, three things I want to emphasise. Firstly, how Townsville itself influenced my career and my general outlook. how that experience led me to change my views about Australia itself and Australian history quite radically, and that I want to emphasize how the location mattered. I came to think in these ways and to research and teach in this way because of where I was living. That is 1,000 miles away, as they used to say, a long, long way from the heartland of Australia and the great capital cities. And this allowed me to see Australia in a different way because of where I was living. Now, I intend to deal with 5 different subjects. I want to talk about how I arrived in Townsville. I want to talk about starting teaching Australian history, which I did in Townsville. Then I'll talk about discovering the First Nations, of which I had known almost nothing. I want to go on indeed and talk about Mabo and the evolution of that great crusade. And then I want to talk finally about the consequences of the Mabo judgment. So 5 quite different topics. Let me begin then with the first. Now, I arrived in Townsville in quite an unusual way. It was quite unplanned and unexpected. Margaret and I were living in London, happily teaching with our newborn son. And for a variety of reasons, it was time we returned to Australia. And I started applying for jobs all around the place. But I didn't get any particular interest. And suddenly, one day, I got a telegram. In fact, in a week, I got 2 great telegrams which changed the course of my life. Now, one was to go to an interview, I didn't know why, in an office in London. And the second was to offer me a job at the Townsville University College, an institution I'd never heard of, and a job I'd never applied for. It appears that the person who had accepted the job had suddenly, at very short notice, declared that he couldn't come to Townsville because his wife wouldn't let him. And so they looked at people who had applied earlier for a job at the University of Queensland. And I had done so, but didn't know that I'd been on the shortlist. And so they looked through their shortlisted people and found my name and offered me a job. And of course, we found this very exciting and accepted, not knowing much about Townsville and only vaguely where it was, because we'd never been to Queensland before. And so that's why we turned up in Townsville. And I started teaching in 1966. Now, coming to Townsville from London, but more particularly coming to Townsville, having grown up in Tasmania, was a quite challenging experience in many ways. Townsville at the time was a seemingly rundown town. This was before the Ross River Dam. It was before Laverack. It was before even there were any traffic lights in the streets. And it was at the end of the dry season, and it was a very, very dry, parched, dusty town. And of course, the whole physical environment was profoundly different. If you move from latitude 42, i.e. Tasmania, to latitude 19, there are many, many things which are different. I mean, the position of the sun in the sky, the sort of shadows that the sun cast, the way the wind blew, all these things were very, very new, but very exciting in lots of ways. But I suppose the most important thing was this was where I began my university teaching career. I had taught in high schools in Tasmania and London, but here I was asked to teach Australian history. Now, at the time, it's not the sort of history I wanted to teach. Being a young Australian, I'd fallen in love with Florence and Venice and Rome, and I saw myself teaching European history. But this was not possible because my head of department had already got that position. So I was asked to teach Australian history. Well, you might say, what could be more normal? But the only problem was I'd done no Australian history, which is not uncommon at the time. There was no Australian history at the University of Tasmania. And so here I was to teach Australian history. I had to do a lot of reading. That was not all that easy because there was only a very small library in the Townsville University College, which was then, of course, at Pimlico. And so early in 1966, I met my first two small classes to begin the teaching of Australian history. It was a course that had been set in University of Queensland, which we were still attached to. The textbook was the book that was used in Brisbane. And I began teaching my students. Now, one of the things that I realized quite quickly was that in a traditional history course about Australia, there wasn't much about North Queensland. North Queensland and the whole of the North Australia was in a way merely playing follow up. The history of pastoral expansion was already well told by the time the squatters moved on to the Darling Downs in southern Queensland. The history of mining in South Australia and Victoria and New South Wales was well known. So what happened in Queensland was simply a recapitulation. And in many ways, if you were a young student studying Australian history in Townsville, traditional history that is, you would get the impression that nothing of much importance had ever happened in your part of Australia. Now, this seemed to me to be an unfortunate thing to have to teach my students, that really, in truly, what really mattered was what had happened a long way away in the south. And in those days, many of my students had never been, certainly perhaps in Brisbane, but no farther south. So I began to think that it was important to begin incorporating local history in my lectures. And I began by getting all the people who knew anything about North Queensland to come and give lectures in my course, in my Australian history courses. And that was indeed the beginning of a very, very important venture into the history of North Queensland, of more of which I'll explain in a moment. Now, by bringing in local people to talk about North Queensland, and I set aside 3 weeks for local history, it meant that gradually we began to get an accumulation of knowledge about the history of North Queensland. Now, Australian history became a first-year course in 1972. And this was really at the high point of Australian history. I had classes of almost 200 in those first few years, which for Townsville University College, or for JCU as it now was, were very, very big classes. And gradually, more and more students decided they wanted to do further study in history, to do honours and postgraduate work. And this meant that gradually over the time, we got more and more people who could seriously talk about the North. Now, one of the landmarks was that in 1974, we published our lectures in North Queensland history. It was one of the first books actually published by JCU. And it included 14 articles about North Queensland. And this, I think, was the beginning of a period of between 15 and 20 years of extraordinary vitality in the history department in Townsville. That is, we began to get more and more students doing serious research. But perhaps the most significant thing is that, unlike most universities, we not only had people doing theses, that is, in this period I'm talking about, we published 4 collections of essays. We published 13 of our own theses, and 5 books were also published coming out of that history department. Now, this is quite extraordinary for what was still a quite small history department. But the most interesting thing was that we were perhaps the only place in Australia where we published ourselves the theses of our students. Now, they were usually honors theses, and we allowed, our honors thesis was probably longer than almost any in Australia, and we gave people time to write these. And we then gave them the real prospect of having their work published, which was quite unusual. And so we gradually accumulated a significant body of work about North Queensland. That is, we became almost our own publishing industry. And as I say, that was quite unusual, but it did mean that we over about a 10 or 15 year period, we produced a lot of historical work in Townsville. And it meant, I think, that we had one of the most dynamic history departments in Australia. Now, some of our southern colleagues said, well, that's all very well, but you're not very good about the theory. Now, that was never a problem in my view. And we went on producing really good, solid history about the North. Now, this was the result of deciding that to teach history, you had to deal with the place where you were. Now, inevitably, in a sense, I had two epiphanies. One I've already talked about. It was the importance of putting the local place into the history you taught. And the second was that if you are to do with the local in North Queensland, you could not avoid the question of race. It was inescapable. Now, I knew almost nothing about the First Nations, about Aborigines and Islanders when I came to North Queensland. I'd learned nothing in my university courses in Tasmania. And in many, many hours and hours of conversation as a student, I don't remember anyone talking about Aboriginal and Island affairs. It was simply something in 1960s Australia that simply had no great interest. There was no great interest in it. So when I came to North Queensland, the discovery of not just the large numbers of Aborigines and Islanders who lived in and around Townsville, but the relations between those people and the Townsville community generally. And this was, as I say, this was a revelation and often quite shocking. And we lived on Milton Hill, and we spent much of our time in and around the city at a time when, before the suburban shopping centres, Flinders Street was the centre of life in Townsville. And so almost every day we saw or heard things which made us think about this relationship between Europeans and Aborigines. Now, inevitably, this too came to influence my teaching. Now, you might think, well, of course you would do that, wouldn't you? But this was the time when Australia, this was at the very end point of what was called the Great Australian Silence by the great Australian anthropologist Bill Stenner. And he said that essentially the Australian historians had ignored deliberately the Aboriginal part of the story. It was, he said, and I'm sorry, I can't quite, yes. It was, he said, a cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. Now, that is an absolutely fair and accurate account of the position of the Aborigines in Australian historical writing at the time that I began teaching. Now, let me refer you, as I've done many times, to the textbook that I was using. This was the textbook most widely used in universities and senior schools in Australia. And it was written by the most important person in the University of Queensland, and in effect, at that stage, our boss, Gordon Greenwood. And it was called Australia, A Social and Political History, a very good book in many ways, a book of numerous authors. Now, the extraordinary thing about this book was that it had nothing about the Aborigines. There was not even an entry in the index. Now, what did you do when you were a young historian just beginning? You wanted to teach your students about the whole question of race, the importance of Aborigines and Islanders in this story, and there was nothing in the textbook that you could turn to. Now, had there been lots of books in the library on this subject, I would have just gone to them and changed my lectures, but there was almost nothing written. And in order to begin teaching this, it was necessary to begin my own research and to encourage my first serious student, Noel Luce, who was my first honours student and my first PhD student, to begin the important story of looking at Aboriginal white relations in North Queensland. And this was where the whole crusade really began. Now, as I say, I had to do the research myself, and I set off, and over 10 years, until 1980, I worked all over Australia and also in Britain, researching this history in order to understand it myself, but also to explain, but not just now to my students, but to Australia as a whole. I wanted to break the Australian silence. And so this I eventually did, I think, because I had the enormous advantage of not doing a PhD, because that would have confined me to one or two small areas, whereas I could go over the whole of Australia, researching everywhere, in every major library and archive, in order to get a national picture, and then begin to write a book that I'm sure no PhD supervisor would have let me do. That is, to write the history of Australia from the other side of the frontier. Now, I didn't know that I could do this until I virtually started. And it was because I couldn't work out, how do you start your story and go from, you know, the Aborigines and Islanders to the Europeans and back, forwards and back, forwards and back. And I suddenly thought, what would happen if I started writing the story from the Aboriginal side of the frontier? And I realized that over 10 years, I'd gathered a great deal of material. And as I began to put this together, I realized that indeed you could write a book called The Other Side of the Frontier. And so that's, in a way, that's where my experience in North Queensland, my teaching led me to write a book about the Aboriginal and Islander sense of Australian history. And I was greatly encouraged by oral history, in particular by the work that Noel and Eddie Mabo did going around Townsville, talking to old Islanders and Aborigines. And that was the thing which really enabled me to start thinking about how could you write Australian history from the other side of the frontier. Now, you may think that I chose wisely, that I caught the wave, that this was the way Australian history was going. But that's far from the truth. I remember when I had, this was in the late 60s, and I'd given my first paper, my first serious paper to a gathering of Australian historians. And it was about Tasmania, which my research had been about before then. And the most important man in the profession, who was the gatekeeper, who edited the major historical journal, said to me, well, now, young Reynolds, you're up there. What are you going to do? Are you still going to write about Tasmania? And I said, oh, I thought I might do something about the Aborigines. And he looked at me and he said, good God. He said, there's not much in that, is there? So this was hardly encouragement. If I hadn't been actually living in North Queensland, I probably would have taken his advice and done something else. But you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that if you lived in the north. I knew this was important. But even when I'd written my manuscript of The Other Side of the Frontier, and I sent it to two important publishers who later published my books. And the first one said, oh, well, this is very interesting, but there was no great enthusiasm for it. But Penguin Books Australia, which was then a very important local publisher, got back to me and said, no, we think there's already too much written about the Aborigines. Now, that was why we published the book in Townsville, because the major Australian publishers weren't interested in it until it was published. And then, of course, they decided, well, yes, perhaps we should publish this, because we sold 5,000 copies by post from the office in the history department of James Cook. So that in a way is where my teaching, my arriving in Townsville, my beginning to teach Australian history, my realization there wasn't much about North Queensland in this story, my inevitable decision that I had to learn much more about the history of race relations and Aboriginal and Islander life. This was what led to the publication of The Other Side of the Frontier. And then, of course, many other books followed. In a way, each book grew out of the previous one. And in the end, I'd written a lot of books. And I have another book coming out in February, which relates to the Uluru Statement. Now, as you probably know, this progression of mine into the history of white Aboriginal relations led in many directions. It led to involvement in filmmaking. It led to involvement in writing a lot for newspapers, to being on radio and television, and of course, a great deal of controversy. And as some of you will know, this resulted in me being seen as the high priest of the black armband, the person who was bad-mouthing Australian history, who was undermining young people's confidence in their country. This led me into what was known as the history wars, which were quite fierce, and took me into the very middle of the culture wars. And that, in a way, was not a role that I chose for myself, but it was one that came to me inevitably. And in a way, it was something that came to me because I was living in North Queensland and I lived there for a very long time. And when I came back from some of the battlefields, the cultural and historical battlefields, and I came back to North Queensland, I knew that this was important, and in a way that the course I'd taken was the right one and was necessary for Australia to come to terms with its past. And it had to come to terms with a past that it had hidden away. It had to break the great Australian silence. And that was a role, in a way, in which was forced upon me because of coming to teach in North Queensland. Now, as many of you will know, one of the consequences of getting involved in Aboriginal and Islander history was that it was impossible to separate out academic study and research from the life of the community, from involvement in the day-to-day politics of race. Now, in this, I was very, very much led into this by Margaret, who, of course, was an activist, then in local government and then in the Senate. But when we arrived in Townsville, she became very quickly involved, deeply involved in the politics of race. That is, she went out one night and came home to be secretary of an organisation called OPAL, the One People for Australia League, with her friend Bobby Sykes. They didn't remain in OPAL for very long, but nonetheless, this was a beginning of deep involvement. She also, in very early years, set up Kindergarten Head Start, which is still, of course, functions in Townsville. And that gave us all sorts of contacts and meeting many, many people, including the Mabos. And Eddie and Margaret were key figures in the campaign for the 1967 referendum and a very, very important interracial seminar which followed it. But this meant that Eddie had been a friend for a long, long time when he came to work at the university. And that was when he and I and Noel Luce spent many lunchtimes together, eating our sandwiches out of our brown paper bags and talking. And much of the talk was indeed asking Eddie about life in Torres Strait. He had, after all, grown up in a very traditional community. And I knew nothing about this, and so I was delighted to be able to hear from him. And this was when we came to that extraordinary moment when we talked about his land ownership. Now, there were three important steps along the way to the Mabo case. The first, indeed, was when we explained to him that he didn't actually own his land. He had no rights to the land whatsoever. Now, other white fellows may well have said these sort of things to him, but he wouldn't take any notice of them. But he respected us and he trusted us and he realized what we were saying was the terrible truth. Now, the second thing is that I knew that indeed in North America, Canada and the US, there was a thing called native title. And there was a great deal of law and a great deal of litigation about it. And I asked my history professor, the head of department, Brian Dalton, who was an American historian, about this. He said, "Oh, yes, of course. There were many cases." So I went back to Eddie and I actually said, "Look, I think there'd be a good chance if you took a court case and argued that you had native title." Now, very, very few people, very few lawyers in Australia knew anything about this because it had never been part of Australian law. So they were two steps. You don't own your land, but you might be able to have a court case. And I did say to him on one of those occasions, if you have a court case and you win, you might be famous. Never thinking that this could actually come about. Here were, a postgraduate student, a very, junior lecturer in one of the most remote institutions in Australia, in the Torres Strait Islanders, working in the gardens. But now there was a third step, which is not as well known. And this was as a result of students of mine, mainly, who were in the Students' Union, who decided to have a conference about Aboriginal land rights, which they did sorry, this is a bit difficult trying to find all my notes. Anyway, they held a conference in Townsville at the university, and they were smart enough to invite all sorts of important people, Judith Wright and Nugget Coombs, but they also asked the only people in Australia who really knew much about native title. Now, this was the critical meeting where Eddie and his friends met these people. Now, they realised that this was possibly the most desirable, the optimum case to take to the High Court. And Eddie realised that these were the people could show him how to get involved in the law. And within a very short time after that conference, the Mabo case had begun. And those key lawyers, Ron Caston and Brian Kean-Cohen, had taken up the cause. And the rest, they say, is history. So 3 steps, but very much 3 steps that were closely related to life in Townsville. Now, it's likely that another successful case might have come out of North Australia, more likely from North Australia than anywhere else. And Townsville, for a variety of reasons, actually was the place where this case had its genesis. So I've dealt with arriving in Townsville, I've dealt with teaching and introducing a great deal of local history and even the publication of local history, and then the coming to terms with race relations in North Queensland, my discovery of the First Nations, and probably the single most important aspect of this was the evolution of the Mabo case that really began in a conversation in JCU about who owned land on Murray Island. So let's move on then to my next topic, and that is the actual consequences of Mabo. Now, Mabo, as you know, was an extraordinary event. I mean, it was unexpected because there'd been so little understanding, even amongst Australian lawyers, about native title, unless they'd studied in New Zealand, Canada, or the US. The judgment came as a complete surprise to many people, a judgment, a 6-1 judgment. Now, the most important and the leading judgment was that of Justice Brennan. And after a very, very long and very, very detailed discussion of the case, after 97 long, not just paragraphs, but long passages, after 97 passages, he issued these famous and unforgettable words. He said that the Meriam people are entitled as against the whole world to possession, occupation, use and enjoyment of the islands of Mer. Now that was a thunderclap that resounded across the continent. It was also became widely known all around the world. And I, at various times, I discussed the case with leaders of the Ainu, the Japanese indigenous people in Tokyo. I talked about this with the Sami in northern Norway at Tromsø. I had a long discussion with the Chief Justice of Norway at his request about the Mabo judgment in Oslo. I met a delegation of the Maasai from Tanzania who'd come to Sydney to understand Mabo. And I talked about Mabo to a leader of the Mapuche Indians in Santiago and Chile. And an old man had tears in his eyes when I told him that in Australia, this case had allowed Aboriginal people to gain at least some rights over their own land. Now, as you know also, this led to the legislation, which of course Margaret was deeply involved in because she was in Parliament in that extraordinary time leading up to Christmas. And the question was whether they'd get home for Christmas before the legislation went through. And then the setting up in 1993, the Native Title Tribunal. Now, in that time, of course, there has been an enormous change in land tenure. Something like 2,500 square kilometres, 32% of the country has been now accepted as being held under native title. And in some parts of Australia, in the Kimberley, for instance, 93% of the land is now held by the native title owners. So this was a revolution of quite extraordinary proportions. The land law of 200 years was overturned. Native title, terra nullius was rejected. And Australia has been transformed by that judgment. So let me go back to where I began. The consequences of Mabo were also seen in the writing of history. It changed the way we saw the past. It changed the nature of what we understood of frontier conflict. It could no longer be dismissed because it now had to be about the ownership of land over the whole continent, which I think made frontier conflict perhaps the most important war in our history. So we came a long, long way from that meeting, those meetings in the history department of JCU so long ago. But in so many ways, I think this takes me back to where I began. So much of this was a result of location. So much of this was the consequence of living in North Queensland for such a long, long time and coming to understand that Australian history was very, very different to the history that I'd been taught, to the history as I understood it. And this consequence of being in Townsville meant not only did my teaching change, my research changed and my writing, but also my engagement with Australian society. And I suppose the most important thing was that there's no doubt that it is perhaps unsurprising that the Mabo case came out of Townsville and came out of JCU. So thank you very, very much, and I'd be most interested in your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Reynolds. That was an amazing journey through really a lifetime of engagement, study, and thinking about the history of the North, and particularly Northern Queensland. We've got questions starting to come in. So what I'll do is I'll read them out to you, if that's okay, and over to you. So we've got 10 minutes or so for questions. So please do use your chat function if you're joining us online, and send them in. So I'm going to read the first question. It's on the topic of statues, including controversial figures such as Robert Towns. This year, we've seen the dismantling of statues of slaveholders in the USA mostly, but also the defacing of statues of figures like this in Australia. As a historian, what is your view of the politics of statue removal and defacement of figures who have been deeply involved with the darker side of history of interracial relations? That's a tough one, Henry.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's one I've thought about, as so many people have in the last year or so. I've written about this even before Black Lives Matter re-emerged. It is a very, very important question. I understand that people get enraged and take down statues, as they've done in Britain, of the slavers, statues of Rhodes in South Africa, and of course many Confederate statues in the United States. I understand this. Towns, indeed, is someone who might well be considered as an appropriate figure to be dethroned. But my feeling is that statues should be reinterpreted. That is, and this has happened in a number of places, that is, you put another plaque on the statue explaining the provenance, why the statue was put up, when it was put up, and then say, however, you know, this is no longer exactly how we see it, and you then give an account of the current view. Now, this keeps the statues there, it keeps them alive, it makes them more interesting. And, you know, maybe in 20 or 30 years, there'll be another view, and statues could accumulate interpretations. And I'd do that rather than simply take them down, because if you take them down, you know, there's no longer anything there at all, unless you replace it with another statue. So yes, I would amend the statue of Towns with a current view of Towns and why people no longer have the view that they had of him in the past.
Brilliant. I find myself nodding because as a North American, you know, it's something that is very topical as well. Over there originally, and that's a wonderful idea. I've never heard anyone say that before. Thank you. Next question. If you were to write a second volume of this Whispering in Our Hearts, who would it include?
That's a very interesting question. I've actually got a new book coming out in February, if you don't mind the plug, called Truth Telling. And it's a response to the Uluru Statement, particularly the question of truth-telling. And in many ways, I deal with these questions there. And I deal indeed with questions like not so much statues as the naming of places. And I'm rather interested in the whole question of Griffith University and the role of Samuel Walker Griffith as the Premier of Queensland in the middle of the Frontier Wars. Now, that seems to be far more pertinent to us now than looking at Cook or Macquarie or these people from the British era of Australian colonisation. So I think there will be much more discussion about this, and in a sense we do have to come to terms. I think Australia is still not quite gone through the full decolonisation project, hence the British monarchy, but also that our law has its foundations based on what the British were thinking in the 1780s. Now, Mabo overturned their idea about law, about land, but no one has overturned the idea about sovereignty, that the Aborigines didn't have any sovereignty. So all of these things will be revealed when the book comes out in February.
Well, I can't wait. It sounds amazing. Look, the next question is, well, there's a statement first. Thanks for your presentation, Henry. It says, will you write a memoir or an autobiography by any chance?
Well, I wrote a memoir called Why Weren't We Told, which is, it's a memoir basically about these things. I don't want to, I don't think, I mean, I think that the interest people would have in me, it relates to my professional life as an historian and as an activist, perhaps a reluctant activist, but an activist nevertheless. And I've written that. Whether I write anything else, I think it may well just be essays rather than a larger or another story about my evolution as an historian and my evolution as an Australian.
Thank you. Next question. We got lots coming in now. What are your thoughts on the recent destruction of the Jabwurrung sacred trees in Victoria?
Yes, I haven't, I mean, I'm only just aware of that, and it's not an issue I know a lot about. But I was deeply involved in Rio Tinto's blowing up of the cave, which I thought was, I mean, of course it was an issue of deep concern for the local people, but it should have been seen as a terrible thing for Australia as a whole, because here was, a place that had been used continuously since 40,000 years ago, and it was one of the places that clearly represented the move of the first arrivals inland, because they certainly for a long time stayed close to the coast, which was familiar with them. But the exploration of the whole continent was an extraordinary venture, which took 20, 30,000 years as the people spread across the whole continent and adapted to utterly different environments. Now, this should have been seen as one of those places which marked the occupation of the inland, because, and in that sense, it was an extraordinarily important site for all of us, not just for the people whose country it was. So I thought that was absolutely appalling. And as I say, it was as though no one appreciated its significance in the history of the continent. I mean, these explorers were far more significant than Captain Cook, whose statues, whose status we get very upset when someone questions. Here was a location of the first explorers and adventurers into the Australian interior.
Yeah, 40,000 years. it's a long time in human terms. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Next question is a bit of a long one, and there's two parts, but I'll read it all in one go. What are your thoughts on the decline of history departments across the country, particularly within the regions, given the role of JCU in helping formulate important stories about Northern Australia generally and Northern Queensland specifically? And then, how do you consider the genre of historic fiction? Does it have a place in popularizing lesser known historical events?
Right, two things. Yes, I mean, the decline of history is terrible. It's true in many, many places. And I mean, James Cook, you know, it breaks my heart that you know, that very large dynamic history department is no more. But this is true all over the country, and it is now true in Tasmania, which once again had a very, very strong tradition of writing local history. So yes, I mean, it's not just an academic thing; it's a cultural thing. It's a terrible weakening of our cultural capacity. But as I say, it's very, very common, and JCU is just one of the places that this has happened. And as I say, JCU in particular affects me personally. On history and fiction, well, if it's done well, I strongly in favour of it. I think Kate Grenville's Secret River was a great book, and a great book about history. There was some controversy with historians, but I probably have read every historical account available, most of them, of so-called massacres, of killing of a significant number of people all around Australia. And yet her fictional account of such an event on the Hawkesbury in the very early days of settlement, I think, is absolutely compelling. And I would, you know, if I was still sort of teaching students, I would tell them, go to that, and you will understand even more than if you just read the historical account. This is a historical recreation that I think was splendid. And I'm sure there are many other historical novels which can play this role.
Yes, fantastic. Completely agree with you. The next one, I haven't been identifying who's asking the questions, but I will on this one because it's actually the Chancellor of JCU, Bill Twiddell. He asks, is it true that Townsville was one of the few places to vote against the 1967 referendum? And if so...
No.
It isn't.
This is interesting.
Okay.
I mean, it's the cities, the major provincial cities up the Queensland coast voted very much like urban Australia, that is high 80s into the 90s. Where you got some of the few places that voted against it were indeed in rural Queensland, in you know, the country towns in Western Queensland, and there you did get a majority against. But no, Townsville, I mean, it surprised us. It was a much better result than we'd hoped for, but there was a very, very strong vote for the two changes of the referendum.
Thanks very much. Couple more, and we're going to let it run a little bit longer than the scheduled end time, if that's okay, because we do have a couple more questions. Are you happy to keep going, Henry?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thanks. So it's always great when you get lots of questions. And they're coming in now so fast that I'm actually having to scroll back. They're overwhelming here. Would you like to see more space in the Australian high school curriculum for Aboriginal perspectives and local histories rather than the current focus on European, American, and Asian histories?
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that should be an important part, and I'm greatly in favour of doing local history from quite an early age, that people understand the history of where they are and can even, as quite young kids, do little research projects and do family history. That's one of the things we started doing, that people we'd get people to do family histories. So yes, local history, I think, should be taught in different ways as a constant theme in history teaching. I'm very much in favour that Australians learn a lot about the world. Probably now as much about Asia as Europe, and certainly as much about the Asian countries with which we have close relations, and with the Western European countries, including Britain. But Aboriginal history, I think, indeed, should be a constant theme of Australia, you know, of what Australians learn. And, you know, one of the profoundly unfortunate aspects is the way in which, despite our massive investment in military history, you know, more than any other country in the spending on the First World War commemoration, there is still no recognition of frontier conflict as warfare. And it should become part of the central story that we tell about Australia. That the Australian, you know, the Aboriginal warriors were patriots who were defending their country, who died defending their country against impossible odds, and it is a vast and heroic story, and it should be taught in that way.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, powerful perspective. Coming down to the last few here, are there useful parallels that can be drawn, in your view, between culture wars and the climate wars, or are they one and the same thing?
Well, in a sense, they are different topics, but they are part of the same culture wars, because quite clearly there is this sharp divide, less so in Australia than in the United States at the moment, on you know, between conservative and liberal. Well, as they call them in America, I noticed that only 25% of Americans regard themselves as liberal, which I found surprising. But there is this sharp division, and it's often the case that all of these issues mount up on both sides of the board. That is, liberal left people have the same sort of views about race and about other social issues as they do about climate change, whereas the conservatives often bring all these together in a basket, almost a basket of deplorables, to coin a phrase. So that whether or not they are organically related, they are politically related, because the way the culture wars are fought out.
Yes, thank you. What suggestions do you have for historians and history teachers in the face of the recent changes to the HECS fee structure in order to encourage and facilitate continued research and study at secondary, tertiary, graduate, and postgraduate levels?
Well, it's very difficult to know what is happening in Australian schools now, because it is so much more decentralised than it used to be. But I've been involved in a project here in Tasmania for middle school, you know, for those years, which will be a very, very strong and very sophisticated programs about Aboriginal Tasmanians and, you know, the whole story. I've been involved in the same sort of work with the Catholic system in New South Wales, and I've recently been talking in Brisbane about their new programs about frontier conflict. So I think this is happening, and there is much wider acceptance that this should be taught. And as I say, I don't quite know why Australians feel they have to identify with the British, you know, the British anymore. I don't see why they can't tell the story of Australia, and certainly the conflict, from the point of view of the Australians who fought and died for Australia in the frontier wars.
Thanks very much. I'm going to now take Chairman's prerogative, and I'm going to ask the last question, if I may. Henry, for those of us like me who never had the opportunity to meet Eddie Mabo. Can you tell us just a little bit about what was he like as a human being, as a person?
Well, he was a very interesting man. I mean, you know, I was extremely fond of him. As I say, he was an extremely interesting person because he had grown up in a very traditional society where there were very rarely any white fellows. And of course, for a long, long time, right up until the 1960s, the islanders weren't allowed to come to mainland Australia. So they, in a sense, Queensland, whether they knew it or not, adopted vis-a-vis the Torres Strait a sense of indirect rule. The islanders basically ran their own affairs, and therefore he only had a limited English education, but he was clearly a man of great intelligence and fierce determination. But he came to mainland Australia in two ways. One, he came with great confidence because his society had never been really undermined. He had that cultural confidence. He was a patriot. He was like a third world nationalist. He was a nationalist, even though his homeland was only two small islands. But nevertheless, he was an anti-colonial nationalist. But one of the things he said he came to Australia for was to try and understand the secret of the white fellas' power. How was it that they were able to exercise such power and authority? And so he was a very, very interesting person in that sense. And that's why when he spent time at James Cook, he used to go to the library, and he became very involved in the story of decolonisation. And he would have proceeded much farther with that. You see, he would have, if he had been able, well, you know, he wanted to claim sovereignty, but his legal advisors quite correctly said, no, just go for property. But had he lived, I think he would have proceeded with wanting to have a totally different relationship with the Australian state, of the sort that places like Norfolk Island have. And in this sense, there was a deep political strain running through his thinking, and it was very much political thinking that would have been understood by third world nationalists all over the world. He was also a very engaging, when he, as I say, when he talked about the island, or, you know, his face just glowed. He shone when he talked about his country. And so in those ways, it was a fascinating way, a fascinating situation to meet him and get to know him. And totally revelatory for me that here was a person who had come out of this totally different society and had come to Australia, and, you know, clearly was living and working and being an activist, but endlessly busy and endlessly doing things and endlessly thinking. Hence, of course, the Black Community School, which Margaret and I were closely involved with, and all these different projects that he had. So yes, he was a very engaging person, and a person whose intelligence simply made you want to spend more time with him.
Well, that's a great way to finish, Henry. Thank you so much. I think your contribution, obviously, to Australia, into the way we see the world and see ourselves, has been amazing. And I just feel really privileged. I've never met you before, but I feel privileged to have shared the last hour with you, and feel like I got to know you a little bit better, and got to know Eddie Mabo a little bit better as well through that firsthand experience. So thank you so much. And look, I had a little bit of a blurb to end with, but instead I thought I'm going to read out some of the comments that are coming in that are not questions, but they're just sort of wrap-up comments. So fantastic lecture and Q&A by one of JCU's great figures. Another says, thank you, Henry, for one of the most stimulating hours that I have recently enjoyed. Let there be more on Zoom. So I think the idea that we've been able to bring together people who normally, wouldn't be able to travel up to Townsville to hear you speak. And that is one of the advantages of this dark time. We've got people that was from somebody who's listening from France, by the way. So, bonjour de la belle France. Moi, je suis Canadien, alors c'est très bon. C'est un groupe complètement international. C'est super bon. Alors, aussi, well done. What a wonderful opportunity to meet and talk with you, Henry, to hear you talk. I enjoyed it immensely. So I guess that's just a smattering of some of the feedback that I'm seeing coming into my screen, Henry. Thank you so much for delivering the annual 2020 Roderick lecture virtually for the very first time. It's been fantastic. We hope that we can have you back sometime, and I'm really looking forward to your new book.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody who's joined us from around the world. Take care and look after yourselves. Cheerio.